The stagecoach hit the washout at full speed, and Marshal Hawkins was already running before the front wheel folded beneath the axle. He had been a quarter-mile up the ridge trail, leading his mule down toward the river ford, when he heard the driver's scream carry over the roar of the meltwater. The road below had been solid ground 3 days earlier, before the Chinook wind came howling out of the west and ate through a winter's worth of snowpack in a single afternoon. Now the mountainside wept brown water from every seam, and the coach road that ran along the shoulder of Elkhorn Ridge had become a trap of soft earth pretending to be firm. He saw the whole thing happen the way a man sees a rockslide begin, too far away to stop it and too close to look away. The coach's rear wheels dropped into a rut the flood had carved overnight. The horses screamed and lunged sideways, and the whole carriage tipped with a groan of splintering wood before it rolled twice down the short embankment and came to rest hard against a stand of lodgepole pine, wheels spinning uselessly at the sky. Marshall left the mule tied to a scrub juniper and went down the slope in long strides, half running and half sliding through mud that sucked at his boots. He was a big man, built through the shoulders and forearms from 10 years of swinging a pick and hauling sluice boxes out of icy creeks, and he covered the distance in a way that made the 2 ranch hands who came around the bend behind him rein up their horses just to watch him move. His hair, longer than fashion allowed in most towns, whipped loose from its leather tie as he ran, and by the time he reached the wreck his shirt was soaked through with sweat and snowmelt both. Anybody living in there? He shouted, already hauling at the door that faced skyward. A muffled voice answered him, tight with pain but steady. 2 of us. The driver is thrown clear, I think, but he is not moving. Marshall put his shoulder into the door, and it groaned open on a bent hinge. Inside, wedged against the downhill wall of the cab, was an older man clutching his wrist, and beside him, one gloved hand braced against the seat frame and the other holding her hat pinned strangely to her lap, as though she had refused to let it fly free even while the world turned over around her, was a woman with dark gold hair coming loose from its pins and eyes the color of good creek water, clear brown with a green undertone that caught the gray winter light. "Give me your hands," Marshall said. "One at a time, I have got you." The older passenger came first, wincing as Marshall eased him up and over the door frame and down to solid ground with the same care he might have used lowering a crate of dynamite. Then he turned back for the woman, and it was only when she looked up at him fully, wiping mud from her cheek with the back of one wrist, that something in his chest went still. "Marshal Hawkins," she said, and there was no mistaking the shock in her voice, nor the disbelief that came right behind it. Of all the men in the territory, to be standing at the bottom of a ditch. He stared at her another second before the years fell away and he saw the girl underneath the woman, 19 years old and laughing on the porch of her brother's trading post, while he tried to teach her to skin a beaver pelt and she kept flinching at the smell. "Adelaide Chandler," he said slowly, as though testing whether saying it aloud might make it less true. "I heard you had gone east for good." "I came back," she said, and reached her hand up to him. "Are you going to help me out of this coach? Or are we going to have this conversation with me still standing on the ceiling?" He nearly laughed despite the wreck around them, despite the driver lying senseless in the mud, and the horses still tangled and screaming in their traces. He reached in and lifted her out bodily, one arm beneath her knees and the other across her back, and carried her clear of the tilted coach before setting her down on solid, if muddy, ground. She was lighter than he expected and heavier than he wanted to admit noticing, and when her hands gripped his shoulders for balance, he felt the strength in her grip, not the fluttering weakness he might have expected from a woman fresh off a coach from the railhead. "You can put me down now, Mr. Hawkins," she said, though her voice had gone a shade softer than her words. "I already did," he pointed out, and stepped back to give her room. The 2 ranch hands had reached the wreck by then, and between the 4 of them they got the driver stabilized, his leg splinted with a broken seat slat and a length of rope, and the horses calmed enough to be led free of the ruined coach. It was cold, unglamorous work, made worse by mud that climbed past their ankles and by a sky that could not decide whether it wanted to rain or snow. Adelaide worked alongside them without complaint, tearing strips from her own petticoat to bind the driver's leg when Marshall admitted he had nothing better, and it was that, more than her name, more than her face, that made him look at her twice. "You have done that before," he said. "I have bandaged worse on the back roads of 3 territories," she answered, tying off the knot with brisk, sure fingers. "A traveling librarian learns to patch up more than broken bindings, Mr. Hawkins." "A librarian," he repeated, and something in his chest, already unsteady from the sight of her, tilted further off its axis. "That is a fair distance from the girl who used to read her brother's ledgers by lamplight because there was nothing else in the valley worth reading." "There was plenty worth reading," she said. "There was simply nobody delivering it. I decided to become the delivery." She looked up at him, and for a moment the mud and the wrecked coach and the injured driver seemed to recede behind the plain fact of her eyes finding his. "I am glad it was you standing at the bottom of that ridge, Marshall Hawkins. I would have hated to owe my life to a stranger." "You do not owe me anything," he said, gruffer than he intended. "Anybody would have run down that hill." "Anybody did not," she said. "You did." He did not have an answer for that, and so he busied himself instead with catching the lead horse, and did not let himself notice how the sound of her voice settled into some old, unused room in his chest, and made itself comfortable there, as though it had never left. The driver was carried to the nearest ranch house on a makeshift litter, and word was sent for a wagon to fetch the coach's freight, but Adelaide would not wait for a proper conveyance to take her the rest of the way into the valley. "I have come a very long way to reach Whitlock's Crossing," she told Marshall, once the immediate crisis had settled into the slower business of arrangements. "I would rather ride the last 5 miles on a mule beside a man I trust than sit another hour waiting for a coach that might tip over again." "You trust me," he said, and could not quite keep the question out of it. "I trusted you 8 years ago to keep me from falling off the loft ladder at my brother's store," she said. "I do not see any particular reason that has changed." So it was that Marshall Hawkins led his mule down out of the ridge trail with Adelaide Chandler riding behind him, her arms looped loosely around his waist for balance, and the valley opening up below them in the gray afternoon light, its river running high and fast and brown with all the mountain's melted secrets. "I did not know your brother had died," Marshall said finally, when the silence between them had stretched long enough that it needed breaking. "I have been up at my claim most of the winter. News does not travel fast to a man panning gravel at 8,000 feet. Her arms tightened slightly around him before she answered, and he felt the small tremor in her voice more than he heard it. "A landslide took the north wall of the storage barn in November," she said. "Jonathan was inside checking the fur bales when it came down. They told me it was quick." She paused. "I did not believe them, but I have decided to act as though I do because the alternative is unbearable. I am sorry, Adelaide." He said her given name without meaning to, the old familiarity slipping out before he could catch it, and she did not correct him. Jonathan Chandler was an honest man. There are not many left in the trading business who can say that. "That is precisely why I have come," she said. "The post is mine now by his will. I intend to keep it running the way he ran it if I can only learn how." Marshall was quiet for a while, guiding the mule around a stretch of trail where the meltwater had carved a gully deep enough to break a leg if the animal misstepped. "The trading business is not book learning," he said at last. "It is trade routes and river crossings and knowing which passes hold snow into June and which ones open early. It is knowing who will cheat you and who will die before they cheat you, and telling the two apart before you extend credit." "Then I suppose," Adelaide said, with a note of steel beneath the polite words, "that I will need someone to teach me." He felt her gaze on the back of his neck, patient and direct, and understood that she was not asking so much as she was proposing a bargain, the same way her brother used to propose trades across the counter of his store, fair and plain, and impossible to refuse without looking like a coward. "I have got a claim to work," he said, though even as he said it he knew it for the weak excuse it was. "You also have a mule going the same direction I am," Adelaide said. "I am not asking you to abandon your gold, Mr. Hawkins. I am asking you to show me a valley I no longer know, in exchange for a fair wage and the gratitude of a woman who does not forget a kindness." The valley did look different than the one he remembered from her girlhood, and he supposed the reverse was likely true as well. 2 new ranch houses had gone up along the river bottom, their fences strung with barbed wire that had not existed in these mountains 8 years ago. A signboard nailed to a cottonwood near the Ford read Continental Valley Land and Cattle Company, Survey Office, 1 mile, in letters too fresh and too confident for Marshall's liking. "There is trouble in this valley now that was not here when you left," he said. "I do not know that it is trouble that ends kindly." "Then it is fortunate," Adelaide said, "that I did not come home looking for kindness. I came home looking for what belongs to me." Whitlock's Crossing sat where the wagon road forded the river beside a stand of old cottonwoods, and the trading post itself was a long, low building of hewn logs with a covered porch running its full length, the kind of place that had clearly once been the beating heart of the valley and now looked, in the fading afternoon light, like a body someone had forgotten to bury properly. The front door hung slightly open. Snow that had drifted in during some earlier storm had melted into a dark stain across the floorboards, and a layer of dust lay over the counter that spoke of weeks without a hand to wipe it clean. "Elia's," Adelaide called, stepping inside ahead of Marshall, her voice carrying a note of hope that made his chest ache on her behalf. "Elia's Whitfield, are you here?" No answer came but the settling creak of old timber and the drip of water from a leak somewhere in the roof. "Your brother had a clerk," Marshall said, remembering the name from a letter Jonathan had once shown him, proud as a new father, describing the young man he had taken on to keep his books. "Whitfield. Steady sort, as I recall Jonathan telling it. He wrote to me after Jonathan died," Adelaide said, moving behind the counter with the careful reverence of someone entering a church. "He said he would keep the post in order until I arrived and that the ledgers and the land deed were safe. That was 6 weeks ago." She pulled open a drawer, then another, her movements growing quicker, less careful. "They are not here, Marshall. The ledgers, the correspondence, and worst of all, the deed to this post and the surrounding claim, all of it gone." Marshall crossed to the back room, where a narrow cot stood against the wall, blankets folded with military precision, a single tin cup and plate washed and set to dry, as though their owner had left in an orderly fashion rather than been dragged off in the night. "He packed before he went," Marshall said. "This is not the room of a man taken by force." "Then where is he?" Adelaide's voice cracked on the question, the first sign of fear she had let show since the coach had overturned beneath her that morning. "Why would he leave, and why would he take the deed with him?" Marshall looked around the small room again, at the neat cot and the swept floor and the window, its latch undone, facing north toward the high country. "I do not know yet," he said. "But I know this valley, and I know the trails a man takes when he is running from trouble rather than toward it. If your clerk left of his own will, Adelaide, then he had a reason he believed was good enough to abandon everything your brother built." He turned to face her, and something in his own chest hardened with a purpose he had not expected to feel again so soon after swearing off other people's troubles for the quiet company of his gold pan. "I will help you find him, not because you are paying me. Because your brother was a friend. And because whatever drove a good clerk out into flood season with a stolen deed under his coat is not something either of us wants loose in this valley without an answer." Adelaide studied him for a long moment, the fading light through the window catching the exhaustion beneath her composure, and then she nodded once, decisively, the way he remembered her nodding as a girl when she had made up her mind about something and did not intend to be talked out of it. "Then teach me the trails, Marshall Hawkins," she said. "All of them. I did not come home to be a woman who waits at a counter for someone else to solve her problems." They left before first light the following morning, While frost still silvered the grass in the low places, the sun had not yet reached, though by midday the same ground would be soft and treacherous under the Chinook's breath. Marshall had traded his single mule for 2 sturdy mountain horses borrowed from a rancher named Osgood who owed Jonathan Chandler an old debt of credit, and was glad to settle it in service rather than coin. And he had packed enough jerked meat, hardtack, and coffee to last a week in the high country, because a search for a man who did not want finding was rarely a short one. "The valley runs about 30 miles north to south," he told her as they rode, the horses picking their way along a trail still firm enough to trust in the early hours. "Whitlock's Crossing sits about the middle of it. There are 4 ways out worth speaking of." The wagon rode south to the railhead at Copper Fork, which is the one your coach came in on. The old Shoshone Trail east over Elkhorn Ridge, which is faster but rougher. Cutter's Pass to the west, which floods first and clears last every spring. And Widow's Canyon to the north, which cuts through solid rock and saves 2 days of travel for anyone willing to risk it. "Why is it called Widow's Canyon?" Adelaide asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would not comfort her. "Because it has made more than one," Marshall said simply. "The walls are narrow enough in places that a man on horseback can touch both sides at once, and when the spring melt comes down off the high peaks, it funnels through there like water through a rifle barrel. I would not take that route now for love or money, and I would advise your Elias Whitfield felt the same, unless something frightened him worse than the canyon does." They followed the river north first, since Marshall reasoned a man traveling alone and on foot, as Elias apparently had been, would keep close to water for both drinking and washing away his tracks. Adelaide proved a quicker student than Marshall had expected, though he chided himself for expecting anything less of a woman who had spent years navigating unfamiliar roads to deliver books and letters to families who might not see another visitor for a season. "You read the ground the way I read a card catalog," she told him, watching him crouch beside a patch of disturbed gravel near a bend in the river. "How do you know that is a man's boot print, and not simply an old elk track washed strange by the water?" "Elk do not wear heels," Marshall said, tracing the impression with one thick finger. "And this heel is worn down more on the outside edge, which tells me whoever made it favors his left leg a touch when he walks. A man walking with a slight limp, moving fast enough to matter but not so fast that he thought anyone was chasing him yet." "That is remarkable," she said, and he found himself absurdly pleased by the plain admiration in her voice, more pleased than he had been by anything in longer than he cared to examine. "It is only paying attention," he said. "Same as you, memorizing which family and which cabin prefers poetry to scripture, and which one wants neither and only wishes for news of the war's end, even 10 years after it ended, because nobody has told them different." She laughed at that, a real laugh surprised out of her, and the sound of it did something to the cold morning air that made it feel, for just a moment, considerably warmer. By mid-afternoon, the trail brought them to the ford at Cutter's Creek, and it was there that the valley's mild winter first showed Adelaide its teeth. The creek, which Marshall guessed had been a modest, knee-deep crossing only a week before, now ran wide and violent, brown with churned silt, carrying branches and once, alarmingly, what looked like the better part of a fence post down its center in a tumbling rush. "We cannot cross that," Adelaide said, and there was no fear in her voice, only plain assessment which Marshall respected more than he would have respected false bravado. "No," he agreed. "Not here, not today. But there is a place upstream where the creek splits around a gravel island, and the far channel runs shallower this time of year, Chinook or no Chinook." He studied her a moment. "It will still mean getting wet to the knee and holding tight to the horse, and trusting that I know this water better than it knows itself. Can you do that?" "I crossed the Platte River on a raft made of 2 barrels and a church pew when a flood took out the ferry near Ogallala," Adelaide said. "I imagine I can manage a Montana creek, Mr. Hawkins." They found the gravel island a half-mile upstream, and the crossing was every bit as unpleasant as Marshall had promised. the horses snorting and fighting the current, the water climbing past his boot tops and soaking Adelaide's skirts to a weight that made her curse under her breath in a manner he suspected her brother would not have approved of, and which delighted him considerably. But they made it across without losing horse, rider, or supplies, and on the far bank Adelaide sat dripping and laughing at herself, wringing water from her hem with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided panic served no useful purpose. "You are not what I remember," Marshall said before he had quite decided to say it. "Neither are you," she answered, tipping her head to study him, taking in, he suspected, the changes 8 years had worked on him just as thoroughly as he had been cataloging hers. "You used to laugh more." "I used to have less to lose," he said, and did not elaborate, though the words hung between them, heavier than he had intended. They made camp that night in the lee of a granite outcrop, a small fire crackling against the deepening cold that always followed the Chinook's false warmth once the sun went down. Adelaide sat close to the flames, her boots drying on a flat stone, and asked him, in the careful tone of someone approaching a subject they suspected was tender, what had put the wariness in him that had not been there before. Marshall was quiet long enough that she might have thought he would not answer at all. "My father held a claim up past Elkhorn Ridge," he said finally. "Good ground, real color in the gravel, enough to make a man comfortable if not rich. A company man came through in the spring of '69, offered to buy him out at a fair price. My father said no, and within a month the company had produced a survey showing my father's claim sat on land the company had already filed for, some clerical business back in Helena that nobody could ever quite untangle. He lost the claim, lost most of what he had saved fighting it in court, and died 3 winters later still trying to prove a dishonest man had cheated him out of an honest life's work." "I am sorry," Adelaide said quietly. "I do not tell you that for sympathy," Marshall said. "I tell you because it is why I pan my own gravel now and do not file claims worth fighting over, and why I would rather die poor and honest than rich and owing my fortune to a lie. I have seen what a company with a lawyer and a printing press can do to a man who has nothing but the truth on his side, and the truth does not always win, Adelaide. Sometimes it only survives if you are lucky, and if somebody stubborn enough refuses to let it be buried. That signboard by the river," she said slowly. "The land company office. You think they are the same sort as the men who took your father's claim." "I know they are the same company," Marshall said. "Continental Valley Land and Cattle bought up half the ground my father's old outfit once controlled. I do not think it is coincidence that they have set up an office 1 mile from a trading post whose owner just died in a landslide, and whose deed has since gone missing along with the only clerk who knew where it was kept." Adelaide was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when she spoke again her voice had steadied into something harder and more determined than grief alone could account for. "Then we had better find Elias Whitfield," she said, "before whoever frightened him decides to come looking for what he took." They rode a wide loop through the northern reaches of the valley over the following 2 days, checking trappers' cabins that Marshall knew from his winters spent working claims in the high country, and it was on the morning of the 3rd day, following a thread of wood smoke that had no business rising from an abandoned line shack at the base of Elkhorn Ridge, that they finally found him. Elias Whitfield was younger than Marshall had pictured, no more than 22, with ink-stained fingers and the hollow, hunted look of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. He came out of the line shack with an old shotgun leveled and shaking, and it was only when Adelaide called his name and stepped forward, arms open and empty of any threat, that the barrel finally dropped. "Miss Chandler," he said, and his voice broke on the second word. "I did not know if you would come. I did not know if anyone would believe me." "I am here," Adelaide said, "and I intend to believe every word, Elias, but you must tell me why you left and why you took my brother's deed with you." He told them the whole of it over a pot of scorched coffee, his hands still trembling as he spoke. 2 weeks before Jonathan Chandler died, a man named Garrett Voss, representing the Continental Valley Land and Cattle Company, had come to the trading post with an offer to purchase the land outright, an offer Jonathan had refused flatly, on principle, the same principle Marshall's father had once died defending. Voss had returned twice more, each time less polite than the last, and after the landslide killed Jonathan, Elias had received a visit in the night from two men who made it plain that the post's deed and the surrounding claim would be considerably easier for the company to acquire if certain paperwork were simply to disappear before the rightful heir arrived to make trouble. "I did not know what else to do," Elias said. "I could not protect the deed sitting alone at that counter. I took it and I ran, and I have been moving between line shacks ever since, waiting for someone I trusted to come." "You should have written to me plainly," Adelaide said, though gently. "I did not know a letter would not be intercepted," Elias said. "Mr. Voss has men watching the road, Miss Chandler. He has had them watching since the day your brother died." Marshall felt the old cold certainty settle into his chest, the same feeling he had carried out of the courtroom the year his father lost everything. "Show us the deed," he said. Elias produced it from a hollow beneath the line shack's floorboards, along with the post's ledgers, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth against the damp. Adelaide unrolled the document with hands that were, for the first time since Marshall had met her again, not entirely steady, and read it through twice before letting out a long breath. "It is exactly as Jonathan described it in his letters," she said. "The full claim, river frontage and all, properly filed and witnessed in 1868. This is genuine and it is mine." "There is more," Elias said, and the fear returned to his voice in full force. "I overheard Voss speaking with another man, someone he called Rourke, hired muscle by the sound of it. They mean to file a competing claim at the land office in Larkspur, backed by a survey they have paid a corrupt man to falsify, and they mean to do it before the territorial filing deadline closes at the end of this month. If your legitimate deed is not filed and recorded ahead of theirs, Miss Chandler, the courts may take years to untangle whose claim stands, and years is exactly what a company like Continental Valley needs to make the question of ownership somebody else's problem entirely." "How many days do we have?" Marshall asked. "4," Elias said. "Perhaps 5, if the roads are as bad everywhere as they are here." Marshall did the reckoning in his head, the way he had once reckoned distances between claims and assay offices. Larkspur sat 2 full days from Whitlock's crossing by the wagon road, more if the flooding along the river bottom continued to worsen, which it showed every sign of doing. The Shoshone Trail over Elkhorn Ridge might save half a day, but it climbed high enough to still hold treacherous ice in the shadowed stretches. And Widow's Canyon, dangerous as it was, could cut the journey to a single hard day's ride, if a man knew its twists well enough to run it at speed. "There is one more thing," Elias said, quieter now, as though ashamed to have saved the worst for last. "Rourke's men know the wagon road is the obvious route. I heard them speak of watching it closely, and of Widow's Canyon besides, should anyone try to save time by risking it. I do not think there is a safe way north out of this valley any more, Miss Chandler. Not for you." Adelaide looked at Marshall across the small fire, and he saw in her eyes the same understanding that had already settled cold and clear in his own chest, that the search for a missing clerk had, in finding him, uncovered a danger considerably larger than the one they had set out to solve. "Then we will need a plan that does not rely on being unseen," Adelaide said, "because I did not come all this way to lose my brother's post to a lie." They rode back toward Whitlock's crossing with Elias and the recovered ledgers in tow, and it was there, on the trading post's own porch with the river running high and loud beyond the yard, that Garrett Voss found them waiting for him. He came alone, which Marshall noted with some suspicion, riding a well-groomed bay gelding that had clearly never known a day's hard work, and he dismounted with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who believed the outcome of every conversation had already been decided in his favor. "Miss Chandler, I presume," he said, removing his hat with theatrical courtesy. "Garrett Voss, representing the Continental Valley Land and Cattle Company. Might I offer my condolences on your brother's passing, and my company's sincere interest in relieving you of a burden you surely did not ask for." "You may offer your condolences," Adelaide said, standing straight-backed at the top of the porch steps with the recovered deed rolled and held against her side like a soldier's colors. "But you may keep your company's interest to yourself, Mr. Voss. This post is not for sale." "Everything is for sale, Miss Chandler, given the right price and the right circumstances." His gaze slid sideways to Marshall, taking in his size, his stance, the way his hand rested easy and ready near his hip, and something flickered behind Voss's eyes that might have been calculation or might have been the first threat of fear. And circumstances in this valley have a way of shifting rather quickly. Floods, landslides, missing paperwork. It would be a shame for a young woman alone to find herself caught up in such uncertainty. "I am not alone," Adelaide said, "and I am not uncertain. I hold a properly filed deed dated 1868, witnessed by the Territorial Land Office, and I intend to have it formally recorded at Larkspur before this month is out. Whatever survey your company has commissioned since, however recently drawn, will not stand against it in any honest court." "Honest courts are a comforting notion," Voss said, his pleasant mask slipping just slightly, enough to show the harder man beneath it. "I would think carefully, Miss Chandler, about how much you wish to risk on the road between here and Larkspur. The mountains are unpredictable this time of year. Even the most careful travelers meet with accidents." "Is that a threat, Mr. Voss?" Marshall asked, stepping down off the porch to stand between the man and Adelaide, close enough now that Voss had to look up a fair distance to meet his eyes, and Marshall watched the calculation behind them shift again, this time firmly toward caution. "It is a fact of geography, Mr. Hawkins," Voss said, though he had retreated a half-step without seeming to notice he had done it. "Nothing more." "See that it stays that way," Marshall said, low and even. "I know these mountains better than any man your company could hire to threaten them. I know the roads and I know the canyons, and I know exactly which of them belong to your kind of danger and which belong to God's. I would not test which is which if I were you." Voss studied him a moment longer, then replaced his hat with the same theatrical care he had removed it, and mounted his gelding without further pleasantries. "4 days, Miss Chandler," he said as he turned the horse toward the road. "I do hope the weather holds for you." They watched him ride out of sight before either of them spoke again. "He will send word to this work tonight," Marshall said. "They will expect us to leave at first light, probably along the wagon road, since that is the route any sensible traveler would choose." "Then we will not be sensible," Adelaide said. "You said Widow's Canyon could save a full day." "If Rourke's men are watching both the wagon road and the canyon, as Elias overheard, then perhaps our best chance is not to avoid the canyon, but to be through it and gone before they expect us there at all." Marshall looked at her for a long moment, weighing the plan against everything he knew of that narrow, flood-prone stretch of rock, and against everything he had come, in the space of a handful of days, to feel for the woman proposing it. "It is dangerous, Adelaide," he said. "More dangerous than the coach wreck that near killed you 5 days ago." "I did not come home to be safe, Marshall," she said, and the use of his given name, soft and certain, settled something in him that had been unsettled for 8 long years. "I came home to keep what is mine. If the canyon is our best chance, then I will ride it, with you or without you." "With me," he said, before he could think better of it, "because I do not intend to let you ride into Widow's Canyon without a man beside you who knows every turn of it by heart." They left before dawn the next morning, riding north along the river in the gray half-light, and it was less than 3 hours later. While crossing a stretch of bottomland the flood had turned into a shallow, treacherous lake overnight, that disaster found them anyway, in a form neither had anticipated. The ground beneath Adelaide's horse gave way without warning, a hidden channel cut by the flood beneath what had looked like solid meadow, and the animal stumbled and went down hard, throwing her clear into the rushing water even as Marshall shouted her name and spurred his own mount forward. The current caught her instantly, dragging her downstream faster than any horse could safely follow along that treacherous bank. And Marshall was forced to choose, in the space of a single terrible heartbeat, between the fast, dangerous route along the water's edge that might catch up to her, and the slower, safer path that would surely lose her. He chose the danger, as he always had, and rode hard along the crumbling bank, watching her dark head bob and vanish and reappear among the debris, until the river bent sharply around a stand of willows and swept her from his sight entirely. By the time he reached the bend, fighting his horse through brush and mud, there was no sign of her at all, only the endless brown churn of the flood and the terrible silence beneath the water's roar where her voice should have been. He searched until dusk, on foot where the horse could not go, calling her name until his voice cracked, following the river's bank mile after mile as it wound north through the valley, finding nothing but a single sodden glove caught in a snag of driftwood, which he pressed to his chest like a man holding the last piece of something he could not bear to have lost. It was full dark before he allowed himself to stop, exhausted and frozen, and hollowed out with a grief he had not let himself feel since his father died. And it was in that darkness, alone beside a cold camp he had not the heart to light a fire for, that Marshall Hawkins understood, with the sudden clarity of a man too tired to lie to himself any longer, that he loved Adelaide Chandler, had perhaps loved her since she was 19 years old and laughing on her brother's porch, and that the thought of a world without her in it was a thought he could not survive carrying alone. Adelaide, for her part, was very much alive, though she would not have argued with anyone who called her fortunate rather than skilled for it. The current had carried her nearly 2 miles before a fallen cottonwood, half submerged and bristling with broken branches, caught her skirts and gave her, for one desperate moment, something solid enough to grip. She had hauled herself up onto the trunk with strength she had not known she possessed, coughing river water and shaking so hard with cold that her teeth rattled audibly, and had lain there a long while simply breathing, before the practical part of her mind, the same part that had navigated flooded rivers and washed out roads across 3 territories delivering books to families who needed them, reasserted itself, and demanded she move before the cold killed her more surely than the river had failed to. She followed the sound of the water rather than fighting it, reasoning correctly that a river always ran eventually toward people, toward bridges and fords and the places men built their lives, and some 3 hours later, soaked and shivering and half convinced she was dreaming, she stumbled into the yard of a homestead belonging to a family named Petrosky, who took one look at her and did not wait for explanations before pulling her inside to a fire and a change of dry clothes. "My name is Adelaide Chandler," she told them, once feeling had returned enough to her jaw to allow proper speech. "I need to send word to a man named Marshall Hawkins. He believes I have drowned, and I cannot allow him to believe that a moment longer than necessary." Mrs. Petrosky, a broad, capable woman with flour still dusting her apron, studied Adelaide with the shrewd assessment of a person who had lived long enough in hard country to recognize both desperation and determination when she saw them together. "There is no fast way to send word tonight, dear," she said. "The roads are worse than the river, and my husband will not ride them in the dark for love or money. But you are welcome to my son's horse at first light, and I will pray your Mr. Hawkins has the sense to search downstream before he does anything foolish." Adelaide spent that night staring into the Petrosky's fire, turning over in her mind everything she had not said to Marshall Hawkins in the 4 days since he had pulled her from an overturned coach, and reached, somewhere in the small hours before dawn, the same conclusion he had reached alone beside his own cold camp 2 miles distant: that whatever she had felt for him as a girl of 19 had not died in the 8 years of their separation, but had only waited, patient as a seed beneath snow, for the season to change. She rode out at first light on the Petrosky's borrowed horse, following the river south, and it was perhaps 2 hours later, rounding a bend where the bank rose into a low bluff overlooking the water, that she saw him. Marshall was crouched at the river's edge, still searching, his face gray with exhaustion and grief, and when he looked up and saw her sitting a horse on the bluff above him, alive and whole and very much herself, he came up the slope at a dead run, the same way he had come down the ridge to reach her overturned coach 5 days before, and did not stop until he had pulled her down from the saddle and into his arms with a force that drove the breath from her lungs. "I thought you were dead," he said into her hair, his voice breaking on the words in a way she suspected he would have been embarrassed by, had he been thinking clearly enough to be embarrassed. "I thought I had lost you before I ever had the sense to tell you I loved you." "I am not dead," Adelaide said, her own voice unsteady now too, her arms wrapped around him as tightly as his were around her. "I am cold, and I am furious with that river, and I have been thinking, Marshall Hawkins, that I have loved you since I was 19 years old and did not have the courage to say so before I left this valley, and I am not leaving it again without saying it now." He pulled back just far enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that seemed almost unbearable given the size and strength of them, and kissed her there on the riverbank with the desperate tenderness of a man who had spent one long night believing he would never have the chance. "We have a deed to file," he said finally, resting his forehead against hers, laughing a little shakily at the absurdity of the timing, "and a canyon to survive. But when this is finished, Adelaide, I intend to ask you to marry me properly, and I would very much like an answer before I do." "Ask me now," she said, "and you will have your answer before we have even reached the canyon." "Then, Adelaide Chandler," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without an instant's hesitation. "1,000 times yes, and now, Marshall Hawkins, we had better ride, because your Mr. Voss will not wait politely while we court." They reached the mouth of Widow's Canyon the following afternoon, having lost the better part of a day to Adelaide's ordeal in the river, and Marshall studied the narrow gap in the rock with a wariness that had not lessened despite his familiarity with it. "The deadline is tomorrow evening," he said. "If we ride hard and the canyon holds, we can reach Larkspur by tonight and file at the land office the moment it opens tomorrow morning." "And if Rourke's men are waiting?" Adelaide asked. "Then we will need every trick this canyon has ever taught me," Marshall said. "There is an old miner's ledge halfway through, cut into the north wall by men working a played-out silver claim 20 years back. Most riders never see it because it sits above the trail behind a fold of rock, but it connects to a game trail that comes out a half-mile past the canyon's mouth. If we are ambushed in the main channel, that ledge is our way out." They entered the canyon at a careful pace, the walls rising quickly on either side until the sky above narrowed to a pale ribbon, and the sound of the river, still swollen and violent, echoed off stone in a way that made conversation impossible without shouting. Marshall rode ahead, watching the walls with the intent focus of a man reading a familiar book for signs of a word out of place, and it was perhaps a mile into the canyon's twisting length that he spotted it. A glint of metal on a rock outcropping above the trail, too regular and too bright to be natural. "Ambush," he said, low and urgent, reining his horse hard to the left even as the first shot cracked out and struck stone inches from where they had been riding a heartbeat before. "The ledge, Adelaide now, follow me exactly." She did not hesitate, driving her horse after his as he cut sharply off the main trail toward a fold in the canyon wall that looked, to any eye but his, like solid rock offering no passage at all. More shots followed them, whining off stone and kicking up gravel dangerously close, and Adelaide felt her heart hammering against her ribs with a fear that was almost, but not quite, larger than her trust in the man riding just ahead of her. The fold in the rock opened, at the last possible moment, into a narrow defile that climbed steeply upward, hidden from the main canyon floor by an overhang of stone, and Marshall led them up it at a pace that would have terrified Adelaide a week earlier, before she had learned to trust both her own hands on the reins and his judgment of the ground beneath them. They came out onto the old miner's ledge, just as 3 riders appeared on the canyon floor below, shouting to one another and firing blind into the rocks where their quarry had vanished. Marshall pulled up short, catching Adelaide's arm to still her horse as well, and pointed silently to a narrow crack in the rock above the ledge, where a single well-placed shot, he had once discovered while prospecting this very stretch, could bring down enough loosened scree to block the trail below without harming a soul. "Cover your ears," he murmured, and fired once into the crack. The result was immediate and thunderous, a cascade of rock and gravel pouring down into the canyon floor below, burying the trail in a choking cloud of dust, and effectively sealing the riders below from any hope of following further, at least not quickly enough to matter. Through the settling dust, Marshall heard cursing and the frustrated shouts of men realizing their quarry had escaped by a route they had never known existed, and he allowed himself a grim smile before turning his horse onto the game trail that would carry them clear of the canyon entirely. "You have made an enemy of work today," Adelaide said, once they had put a safe distance between themselves and the canyon's mouth, her voice still shaking slightly with the aftermath of fear. "I made an enemy of him the day I chose not to sell my silence to Voss's company," Marshall said. "Today I only made him considerably more inconvenienced." They rode into Larkspur an hour after midnight, exhausted, filthy, and triumphant, and slept what remained of the night in the town's single small hotel before presenting themselves at the land office the moment its doors opened the following morning. The clerk who examined Adelaide's deed was a thin, careful man named Abernathy who took one look at the document's proper seals and witnessing signatures, and pronounced it, without hesitation, entirely in order. "There has been another party inquiring about a claim in the same section," he said, glancing up at them over his spectacles. "A survey filed only yesterday afternoon, in fact, though I confess the paperwork struck me as irregular even before you arrived." "Irregular how?" Marshall asked. "The witnessing signature belongs to a surveyor who has not, to my certain knowledge, set foot in this territory in over a year," Abernathy said. "I had already begun to suspect fraud before your deed arrived to settle the matter beyond any doubt. Miss Chandler's claim, being both earlier in date and entirely properly executed, stands without question. I will be recording it this very hour, and I will also be forwarding my concerns about the competing filing to the territorial marshal in Helena, as fraud against this office is not a matter I take lightly." Adelaide let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and beside her Marshall reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers without any thought for who might see, and found he did not care in the least who did. "It is done, then," she said. "The post is mine, properly and permanently, and Mr. Voss's company has nothing left to threaten me with." "They will find other schemes in other valleys," Marshall said. "Men like that always do. But this valley, Adelaide, and this post belong to you, free and clear, and no amount of forged paperwork will change that now." The ride home to Whitlock's Crossing took 2 easy days, the weather having settled at last into the true, hard cold of a proper mountain winter rather than the false, treacherous warmth that had nearly cost them everything. And by the time they crested the last rise above the valley and saw the trading post's roof smoking cheerfully below, word had already spread through every ranch and homestead for 20 miles of what had happened at Widow's Canyon and at the Larkspur land office both. The valley's response was not what either of them had expected. Rather than fear of further trouble with Continental Valley, the settlers and ranchers who gathered at the post over the following days seemed to draw a fierce, communal pride from the story, as though Adelaide's victory over the land company's schemes belonged to all of them rather than to her alone. Osgood, the rancher who had lent them the horses, arrived with a wagon load of milled lumber to repair the storage barn the landslide had destroyed. Mrs. Petrosky sent her husband with 3 fat hens and a jar of preserves, along with a note declaring herself deeply invested in seeing Miss Chandler settle happily in the valley she had fought so hard to keep. Even Elias Whitfield, restored to his post behind the counter and no longer looking over his shoulder for Voss's men, seemed to stand a little straighter each day, as though the whole valley had exhaled together after weeks of held breath. Garrett Voss himself did not return to Whitlock's Crossing. Word came a fortnight later, carried by a freight driver who had heard it in Larkspur, that Continental Valley Land and Cattle had recalled him to their offices in Helena, following an inquiry from the territorial marshal into irregular land filings across 3 counties, and that a man named Rourke had left the territory entirely rather than answer questions about gunfire in a canyon that several witnesses, including 2 ranch hands who had seen the whole ambush from a distant ridge, were more than willing to describe in detail to any lawman who asked. "It is not everything," Marshall said one evening, as he and Adelaide sat together on the post's porch watching the last color drain from the sky above the western ridge. "There will be other companies, other schemes, other honest men cheated out of what is theirs. I cannot promise you this valley is safe forever." "I am not asking for forever safe," Adelaide said, leaning into the solid warmth of his shoulder. "I am asking for a life worth defending and people worth defending it beside. I believe I have found both." He turned his head to look at her, and in the fading light she saw the same wariness she had noticed on the first day of their reunion, though it had softened now into something gentler, something that trusted rather than merely endured. "I built a life alone for 8 years because I believed it was safer that way," he said. "Safer to trust gravel and gold pans than people, because gravel does not lie to you and gold pans do not disappear when a company offers them a better price. You have taught me in less time than I would have believed possible that a life built alone is not safety at all. It is only a smaller kind of loss, stretched out over more years. And you have taught me every trade route in this valley," Adelaide said, smiling now, "which was rather the whole point of asking for your help in the first place, though I confess I did not anticipate falling in love with my instructor along the way." "I did not anticipate falling in love with my pupil," he said, "though I suspect, if I am honest with myself, that I fell in love with her the first time she laughed at me for teaching her to skin a beaver pelt, 8 years before either of us had the sense to say so." They were married in the valley 3 weeks later, on a clear cold morning, when the last of the winter's false thaw had given way to honest, settled snow that lay clean and unbroken across the meadows around Whitlock's Crossing. The trading post's porch, freshly repaired, was hung with evergreen boughs that Osgood's children had gathered from the ridge, and nearly every family in the valley had come, filling the yard with wagons and horses and the particular warmth of a community that had, in its own quiet way, fought alongside the 2 people standing now before a traveling circuit preacher who had happened, by great good fortune, to be passing through on his winter rounds. Adelaide wore a dress of deep blue wool that Mrs. Petrosky had sewn for her in the weeks since the flood, her hair loose beneath a simple wreath of dried mountain flowers. And when Marshal Hawkins turned to watch her walk toward him across the frost-bright yard, the whole gathered valley saw plainly on his face the thing he had spent 8 years learning to hide, and had, in the space of a single flooded season, learned instead to let show without shame. "I'm Marshal Hawkins," he said, when the moment came, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "Take you, Adelaide Chandler, to be my wife, to walk beside me on every trail this valley holds, easy or hard, and to trust that the honesty between us will outlast every flood, every false claim, and every winter this mountain sends our way." "I, Adelaide Chandler," she answered, her own voice clear and sure in the cold, bright air. "Take you, Marshal Hawkins, to be my husband, to trade my trust for yours as fairly as any bargain my brother ever struck across his counter, and to build with you a life that is neither his nor mine alone, but ours together, for as long as we both shall live." The preacher pronounced them married to a cheer that rose up from the assembled valley, loud enough to send a flock of startled sparrows wheeling up from the cottonwoods along the river, and Osgood's fiddle struck up a reel before the echo had even faded, and Elias Whitfield, grinning wider than anyone had seen him grin in months, produced from behind the counter a bottle of good whiskey he had been saving, he claimed, for precisely this occasion. Marshal Hawkins kissed his wife on the porch of the trading post that had once belonged to her brother and now belonged, in every way that mattered, to both of them together. And if his hands, roughened by years of gold pans and pickaxes, trembled slightly as he cupped her face, it was not from any fear that remained in him, but only from the plain, overwhelming fact of having found, against every hard lesson his own life had taught him, a love worth every risk the mountains had thrown at them to earn it. The valley settled that evening into the particular contentment of a community that had weathered a hard season together and come through whole, its trading post lit warm and golden against the early winter dark, its trade routes, north and south and east and west, all safely known now to the woman who would keep it running for years to come, and beside her, always, the mountain man who had taught her every one of them, and who had, in the teaching, found a home he had long ago stopped believing he deserved.